Okay, ladies and gentlemen, getting ready to start here. Tuning in, counting down. Audio on, video ready. Are we ready? Okay. And 3, 2, 1. Boom! Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to my studio here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. My name is Michael Markowsky, and I'm going to be your photography instructor for the next 1 hour. And as you know, sometimes we go over just a little bit. And at the very end of the stream, I usually save around half hour, 45 minutes or so, depending on how many people are watching, for any feedback on photos that you may have sent me over the course of the last 48 hours or so, or any other questions that may have come up that I haven't had a chance to get to over the course of the last 3 episodes. And if you're just tuning in right now and you haven't seen me ever before, you don't know who I am or anything, you can, in the description below, you can see links to my website, Instagram, Facebook, whatever other books that are out there, as well as the first 3 episodes. There's a playlist that you can click on and you can watch all 3 episodes. I would say that going forward, it is going to be difficult to follow along completely if you haven't at least watched last week's episode. And I know for some people, watching last week's episode might have, some of that stuff might have seemed fairly straightforward. But if you're able to do what we did last week, then everything else we're doing gets so much easier and so much more exciting, because now that you know how to adjust those settings, then you're going to find everything else is really easy. And we'll do a quick little review here before we go jump right in, because I know some people may not have too much free time to practice some of the stuff. We'll do a quick review, and then we're going to launch into the exposure triangle, which is really the kind of the infographic that a lot of photographers use to help understand the main 3 functions of your camera. Okay, so, and just before I also get going, if you find this of value, please like and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to give a small donation of $100 or $10,000 or $1, somewhere in between there, feel free to do so. It's not mandatory, but, you know, you're getting a lot of free education. Usually I charge for these classes, but during this current situation, this is a way for me to keep myself busy. And also, when I'm teaching these classes and people miss a class, I could just say, hey, go watch episode number 4. And I've covered a lot of the stuff we do in class. So, okay. I hope you have your camera handy. Let me see. I'm going to grab my Canon camera here, and let's go to, okay, just making sure that's some weird volume. I'm just going to move my sketchbook. You remember these sketches from, I think this was last Wednesday's class, so our second class, we did those. So I'm just going to get the Canon camera out here, and we're just going to quickly review what we did last week. And I want you to do this with me. You can't just watch these classes and figure you're going to get it all, and then you're going to go out on a walk and start taking fantastic photographs. Your friends are going to hire you to do websites or weddings or whatever it is. You need to actually do this stuff. So if it comes easy to you, then that's really good. That's really exciting. I'm going to have a little sketchbook here for writing down some notes of the settings we're going to use. Okay, so I took the lens cap off of my camera, right? First thing. I'm going to now turn my camera to the setting with the lightning bolt crossed out, all right? Okay, I'm going to turn my camera on, all right? So turned my camera to the auto mode, and I think I've explained that enough times. So now, you know, you can see in the back of my camera maybe some information. If your camera goes dark like this and you can't see anything, you're like, what? I can't see. You can press usually the info button on the back of your camera, or it might be on the Nikon, the I button, and usually that takes it illuminates the back screen. Because sometimes, let's say you're in a venue and you're taking photographs of, you know, children doing a concert, and you want this screen to be black because it's, you know, too many people are getting distracted by this glowing screen, then you can kind of mute the screen, right? Anyway, so I've got that on, and then let's just take a very generic photograph here. So here, I'm going to put this little sculpture on the table, and I'm going to try to take a photograph of it from above. Now, sometimes if this is pretty close, like I guess you can't really see on the other camera up here, but you know, I'm maybe a hand's length away from this image, so I might need to go a little bit higher, and maybe I'll just kind of move right in here so that we can see right here. Oh, anyway, let's just take this photograph. Okay. So it's not going to show up super fantastic on the screen above, but we took that photograph. Let's press now the play button so we can look at the most recent photograph. Now, last class we talked about looking for the EXIF data on here, and that is, it's basically just the information that tells us what the settings were that the camera used in the auto settings. So I press the info button, and I've got right here, when I touch it once on the Canon, I've got the shutter speed and aperture, but I'm missing the ISO. So I tap it again, and just as a quick review, you know, I see these details, and I'm just going to point them out one more time for people. We have up here 1/40th of a second is my shutter speed, aperture 4.5, and ISO 2000. So let me just, I'm going to write that down, and it'll be worth having like a sheet of paper that you can write some of this stuff down on. So I'm going to write shutter, I'm just going to write it all out so people see, aperture, and ISO. Okay. And because I forget what those settings were, I'm going to bring them back up here. And so my shutter speed was 1/40th of a second, f4.5 is the aperture, and ISO was 2000. Okay, oops. So now I'm going to switch my camera into manual. I'm in manual mode. And of course, your settings are going to be different than mine, right? Who knows what you took a picture of? So they're all going to be a little bit different. So as you remember, I'm going to turn the command dial till I get to that same setting, 1/40, 1/40th of a second. So I've now set my shutter speed, right? The command dial turns is usually the default. I'm now going to hit down the plus and minus button, which on the Nikon was on the very top. And I explained all this last week for the Nikon camera, so I'm not going to do it all again. 4.5 was my aperture, right? Now I set my aperture. And then ISO was 2000. And then remember I was saying last week, some people might run into this problem. Well, here's the problem right now. I managed to recreate it right off the bat, which is great. So I look at my camera and I see or the ISO that the camera selected was 2000. And now I have 1600 or 3200. Those are the options that this camera gives me. A more expensive camera would allow me to choose, you know, maybe a dozen or more different ISO settings. You know, the less expensive the camera is, the less options it's going to give you, right? That's just, you know, you buy a cheap version model of the car without the CD player, who uses a CD player these days, then you're not going to get all the fancy functions. Same thing with a cheaper camera, right? And your camera may be $500. That's a cheap camera? My goodness. Well, yeah, there's cameras out there that cost $10,000, $20,000, $30,000, right? So $500 is, in relative terms, a less expensive, cheaper camera. That's just the way that the industry is, right? Okay, so my camera just went to sleep a little bit. Okay, so in this instance, I'm going to try for the 1600. Okay, so that's, now if I try to take this photograph again in this setting, let's just do this here. Take this photograph, and then I'm going to look at both, these photographs side by side. Now, you're not going to be able to see too much here over in the overhead, but this image, the second one I just took, is a little bit darker than the first one I did. All right, so the first one is a little bit brighter, second one's a little bit darker. Yeah, maybe I'm a little bit closer to the object. In fact, how about I'm just going to delete that, just so somebody is like, oh, well, it's not the same. So this was maybe a little bit closer up. And then I'm just going to press play, and the first one there, I'm going to delete that. So I've got two pictures, and so the second one is darker. Now, the reason why it's a little bit darker is because I selected a different ISO. So the one that I couldn't use 2000, so I went down to 1600. Now, in just a few moments, I'm going to explain what these settings are and what they do, because so far we've just been taking photographs in the auto mode and replicating them in manual mode. So you're just like, okay, this is great, now I know how to do that. What difference does that make? So that's today's episode is we're going to answer those questions. Okay, as a reminder, if there's any photographs that you want me to give you feedback on, there's links to my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter if you want to send them to me at the very end of class. In about 45 minutes or so, I'll have a chance to look at some of your photographs. So, okay. So we've recreated these settings. We've taken a photograph. That's pretty good. This is, even just this, if you're able to do this, makes a huge difference. Because most people aren't even able to adjust the shutter speed or aperture or ISO on their camera, and that really limits them to only being able to use the auto functions of the camera. And when you're stuck on auto, the kind of one of the analogies that I usually make in relationship to like manual versus auto is automatic is like a taxi, getting in a taxi cab, right? You call them up and you say, hey, I want to go from my house to the airport. And the taxi driver goes, okay, sure. And you get in, you're sitting in the back of the cab, you could be checking your email, you're not really fully paying attention. The taxi driver goes whichever way she wants to go until she gets to the airport, right? So you don't really have that much control, right? Whereas manual is like, you have your own car and you can go wherever you want to go. You're driving down the freeway and you decide, oh, I want to get a hamburger. So you pull off and you go here. You decide, oh, there's traffic here. I'm going to go in this direction. So you have full control over where you're going, right? So there's pluses and minuses to both situations, obviously, right? Sometimes it's really nice to take a cab and just shut your mind off. And sometimes well, I don't use automatic as a professional, like it wouldn't make sense, but because I want to be able to have full control. I want to be able to go where I want to go, and I want to be fully responsible for how I get there, right? And to be able to take any detours along the way, if that makes as you can see, there's lots of analogies when it comes to photography. When we're taking photographs and we're trying to describe the process of taking photographs, there's always like, what is the best way to explain this so that other people can get it, right? So I lay in bed at night sometimes thinking about, like, there's got to be a way to make this as simple as possible. Okay, so we've recreated that photograph a second time. That's the next, so that's the big thing. So now, I'm going to now give you an introduction to the exposure triangle, as promised on the thumbnail for this image. So, the first question is have you seen this image before? Does this look familiar or not? Right? For most people, if you're taking this class, I would say majority of people have not seen this image before. This should be fairly new. But if you've spent any time like looking at photography manuals or books, you'll see the exposure triangle come up because it is one of the foundational tools photographers use to explain photography. And so what we see in this diagram are the 3 settings that we learned how to set last week and are reviewed just today. Right? We have aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Right? Those were the first, and really the only things that you, when it comes down to it, you need to know. And if you know what these 3 settings do, and then how to change them, and what changing them does, you can use any camera. Whether I can't tell you how many times I've gone somewhere to a party or an event or a wedding, and people go like, "Oh, you know how to take photographs? Do you mind taking some photographs of my concert or whatever?" I'm like, "Oh, okay, sure." And they hand me some camera that I've never even seen or held in my hands before, but fumbling around with it for a couple minutes. Oh, okay, this is how this thing works. Okay, I've got it, and I can do it. So. But if I was to give you a camera that you've never seen before, learning how to use it could be overwhelming. So once we understand the exposure triangle, then a lot of that is going to make a lot more sense. Okay, so I'll also say that over the next, basically for the next 6 more classes we have after this, we are going to be spending 2 classes on shutter speed, and 2 classes on aperture. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about ISO and a little bit next week. So the next Monday and Wednesday we're going to spend the entire 2 classes, 2 hours and change, talking about aperture and how to control aperture. The week after, 2 full classes talking about shutter speed. So, because those 2 settings are the ones that really create, can really change fundamentally what a photograph looks like when you change them. ISO is maybe a little bit more straightforward and I think a little bit easier for most people to comprehend. Okay, so as you can see, the exposure triangle is organized as a triangle because there are these 3 primary settings that we need to understand. It's not a square, it's not a circle, it's a triangle because there's 3 things. Those 3 things are all you need to do in order to get a good exposure. And okay, so to give us the quick introduction to the shutter speed, or to the exposure triangle, let's start out down here on the bottom with ISO. So ISO stands for International Standards Organization. And this name title goes way back to, well, early photography. And it's kind of stuck. There's been a few attempts to kind of change it and come up with a different name. But essentially, ISO is, and I think, let's go, I'm going to jump just a few things over here in my handout. So the ISO controls the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. It controls how bright or dark the picture is going to be, just like shutter speed and aperture do, but in its own way. So all 3 of those settings control how much light gets into the camera. The ISO is sort of like the volume button on your camera. And If you're in a situation where there's a lot of light, right, then the sensitivity of your camera can be really low, right? There's, you know, it's sort of like your eyes when it's really, really bright. Well, you know, it's so bright that we want to put sunglasses on. And for a camera, we would put on some kind of a filter, like an ND filter, right? To kind of neutral density filter that would cut down the amount of light because it's so bright. So, but if we're going in a situation where it gets darker and darker, then we want to make the camera more sensitive so that it can capture that picture. So, you know, all of this sounds great, but there is implications for turning the ISO, or let's say the volume, up or down, right? If we go back to the analogy of volume, you know, if you're in your car and there's some kind of a song on the radio, and it's really, really quiet, if you turn up the volume, right, and you're trying to hear it, and you keep on turning it up, and now you're turning it all the way up because you're like, I can't hear anything. This is like sound when it was recorded was so low. What happens if you've had that experience is everything starts to sound like it's not nice, clear sound. It's a little bit muddy and grainy, and it just sounds staticky, right? Well, that's exactly what ISO is doing, right? So we always want to use the lowest ISO setting whenever possible, right? So because the more that you make the camera sensitive, the more what we call noise is introduced into the image, right? So there's, or kind of depending on the camera, some really nice cameras like the Fuji system that I have, that I shoot on primarily, I actually find when we get into the higher ISOs, it's not so bad. It kind of has this little wormy texture. Some people despise it. I think it looks kind of a lot like film grain. But you'll notice this a lot, like actually, maybe we can even just see this in this handout. This is kind of sort of what ISO looks like. Do you see, maybe on your television screen, you see how this looks a little pixelated like that? Now that is kind of a similar result to high ISO, right? Things just get a little bit kind of grainy and we lose some of the sharpness of detail. So we always want the ISO to be as low as possible. So the other thing that I would say is if you remember using an analog camera where you used to put the film into the camera, and and then you wind it across, close the back, and wind it up, and then take a picture, and then you had to wind again. If you remember taking a photograph like that, then you probably remember going to the convenience store, and you remember, you say like, my mom sent me over here to get some film for our birthday party, and the person behind the counter would say, oh, well, what kind of film do you want? 100, 400, 800, 5,000 film? And you say, I don't know. I was sent here with $10 to get another roll of film. I don't know. And so the clerk would say, okay, are you shooting photos indoors or outdoors? And you say, well, kind of both. So the clerk would go like, oh, okay, well, are you going to be more indoors or outdoors? Because if you're only going to buy one film, I could sell you 2 different films. You're like, no, I only have enough for 1 roll. And I'm like, okay. Well, yeah, most of the party's taking place outside. Okay, outside. Oh, it's a nice, bright, sunny day. I'm going to give you the 100 speed film. And that's $6. And you're like, oh, okay, great. And, well, just out of curiosity, how much are some of the other ones? Well, the one that I would suggest for the inside part of your party would be this, like, 800 or 2,000 speed film. And you're like, oh, okay, oh, well, sure, I'll get that. How much is that? Oh, that's $16. Whoa, what? $16 for that? Like, what's the difference? Well, the difference is that, higher speed film is more expensive because it's more sensitive to light, and they were also less common, right? Usually they would be 100, 200, 400, 800 would be the most common kind of speeds of film. So you would buy a specific speed of film and put it in your camera, and then once it's in your camera, you're kind of trapped into that sensitivity of film speed, and then now you kind of want to take, you don't want to take 5 photographs and then take the film out, because then you've ruined the whole roll. So you would then go inside and you're trying to take photographs, and when you get those photos back, the ones that you took indoors on the 100 speed film, they're all going to be really dark. You're going to be, why is that? Like, what's wrong? Well, so that's in a long story. That's one of the struggles photographers dealt with for 100 years, is the limitations of having to use a whole roll of film that only had one speed in it. One of the evolutionary leaps forward with digital cameras was an ISO that could change from photograph to photograph to photograph. In fact, you can even set it on ISO for it to move up and down. You can set the ISO on its own to auto. That's a whole other thing we'll talk about shortly. So that is amazing, because now we can take photographs outside, and then 5 minutes later go inside, take a photograph, and with a different ISO, and then go back outside, take more photographs, put the camera back on the shelf, 2 weeks later come out, right? So that meant that we had so much more flexibility when it comes to taking photographs, versus the analog cameras were very limited. You'd have some photographers still to this day will have 2 or 3 cameras on their hips. A wedding photographer might have different cameras back in the day with different speeds on it. Today, photographers still do that, but maybe have a different lens on the camera. But I digress. Anyway, so ISO is essentially that, like the different speed of film, and you want to use the lower number of ISO. So I'll just kind of turn my camera. We're on manual. And if I just, let's bring up, it's this one, just to kind of jump back here. So when I tap ISO, I've got, your camera may have more or less options on here, but I can cycle through, in here, I got 8 settings, including an ISO auto setting, right? So, but we're going, for our purpose right now, we're going to ignore that, because I want to show you the full manual settings and how to use that. And then if you fall back a little bit, then you can, this would be your fallback line, is to try using manual mode but with auto ISO. But again, let's so our ISO, we can select these different settings. We always want to use the lower one because it's going to create the crisper image. But that's not always going to be possible. There's going to be times where you're at a birthday party and it's so dark, you got to crank your ISO all the way up to the top. I'll show you some images in a bit with some different settings, but we're going to go through the 3 different main techniques or main tools of your camera for creating an exposure before we do that. Okay, so the second one that we're going to talk about is the shutter speed. And again, in 2 weeks, we're going to spend Monday and Wednesday talking all about shutter speed and all the different settings for shutter speed. Oh, sorry, I'm going to bring this back here. We're going to spend 2 classes talking about it and different exercises we can use to learn about shutter speed. But just for the sake of understanding the exposure triangle, the shutter speed controls how long the shutter, that little mirror, is open for, right? So you remember when I had my camera like this and I was taking photographs and showing. So this here is a 1/40th of a shutter speed from our earlier example. Now I'm going to crank it up to, let's say, 1 second. Just see if I can get this oriented. So, right, so 1 steamboat, right? Or I can crank it again up to, let's go, we're going to waste too much time, but let's say 5 seconds. 1 steamboat, 2 steamboat, 3 steamboat, 4 well, I'm sure it's more accurate than my own counting. Okay, so you can see when I'm pressing the shutter release, the mirror stays open longer, allowing more light into the camera, right? So the longer the mirror is up, the more light comes in, and therefore the brighter the picture is going to be, right? So if we're in a nighttime environment, we're trying to take pictures of stars, for instance, then you're going to want to do a long exposure photograph, so the shutter is open for longer. I will show you some photographs I did recently of like some starscapes, nighttime star photography, astral photography they call it, and I'll show those to you in a couple of weeks so that you can kind of see. I'll explain the whole process and technique, so that works well if we have a low light situation. We want to slow the shutter speed down to let more light in to brighten the image. On the other end of things, but what happens is when the shutter is open for a long time, is if somebody is moving or dancing, and we have a long, this is me dancing, a long shutter speed, then the final image is going to be all blurry because it's a slower shutter speed. So how do we avoid that blur and movement? Well, we have to speed the shutter speed up so much that we can go all the way to the other end to, I think we had like 1/4000th of a second. Some cameras go super fast into like the hundreds of thousandths of a second, you know, to capture a bullet piercing something, right? But what happens when the shutter is only open for literally a fraction of a second is very little light can make it through the lens into the sensor, right? When that mirror is only flips up for just a second or half a second or 1/100th of a second or 1/8000th of a second, then barely any light gets through. It's sort of like turning the tap on your faucet on and off real quick, right? If I had a cup of water underneath the kitchen sink and I just turned the tap on, right, there'd be like maybe one drip would make it into the bottom of the cup, right? So if I wanted more water in my cup, I would turn the tap on and let it fill up for maybe 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, however long the cup is, just like we would let the shutter speed stay open for longer. Okay, so obviously if you want to take a photograph of somebody hitting a baseball with a baseball bat, or a bird flying through the sky like you saw in the thumbnail for one of the earlier images, that's a fast shutter speed, right? Because we're trying to freeze action all of a sudden. So we'll come back to talking about shutter speed later on. Maybe it just, in last class, in the beginning of today, we talked about how to change the setting on your camera. Okay, and then the last thing here, the last side exposure triangle that we'll talk about, and then I'm going to show you how to take photographs using your exposure meter. So that's coming up here in about 5 minutes or less. So Aperture is, I think, the most exciting setting or tool for controlling light on your camera. Whether you know it or not, the Aperture tool is probably the reason why you bought this camera to begin with. It's why you decided, oh, I'm going to buy a camera in addition to my iPhone or Android or whatever, right? And because the Aperture, more than anything, is the setting that produces images that people identify as professional or really good photographs. You may not even know why, but you look at some photographs and think, wow, that is way better than the photograph I'm capable of taking on my phone. Like, how did you do that? Or who did you pay to take that photograph? So, because what the aperture control allows us to do is control what's called the depth of field, or how much how much of the image is an acceptable focus and the range. So I'm not going to get into all, but essentially, is the background in focus or out of focus, right? If I'm taking a picture of somebody's face, can I see details in the background, or are they blurry, right? So often portrait photographers use a aperture number that is very low, right? And the thing that I always, the kind of rule that I would talk about is, the lower the aperture number, the less things are in focus, or the shallower the depth of field, right? The higher the aperture number, the larger the depth of field is, the more things that are in focus, right? So if you're taking a photograph of somebody's face and you want just their face to be in focus, but the background to be blurry, and even the foreground to be blurry, then you want a low number, right? So versus if you want to be able to take a picture of somebody's face and you have 5 people standing behind them, let's say you're taking a group photograph, then you want a higher number because you want to take pictures with a bigger depth of field. So again, when we start taking next week, we're going to spend the whole class and next Wednesday talking about aperture and all the different settings. So, but and we've talked about how to set the camera. So here's just a quick little review of Canon and Nikon settings. And the other thing too is just kind of worth mentioning is the aperture is also usually marked with an F, right? And it could be any kind of, it could be written in this kind of fancy cursive or whatever kind of way, or just a regular F, because we refer to them as f-stops, like f-stop 4.5, f-stop 1.2, f22, you know, so that if you hear a photographer saying like, oh, put it to f8, right? They're talking about the aperture, because they may not say aperture 8, they're saying f8. Right? Versus if somebody says it's 1/40, they're talking about shutter speed, because shutter is the only one that is communicated as a fraction, right? And then usually people would probably say ISO 1600 or 2000, right? It would be weird for them to say. You might hear some, if they want to set, or somebody like set your camera to 1/200 f22 and ISO 800, right? So anybody else who is setting their cameras, trying to sync them up, that would be, that you would understand what that meant. Okay, so those are the 3 things, and those are a rough, very quick introduction to what they do. Now let's go back up here. So the reason why this is demonstrated as a triangle is that whenever we make a change to the setting, it's going to allow more or less light into the picture. And to compensate, we want to, like in this original example where I took a photograph and it was a little bit darker, right? If I wanted to brighten the picture back up, I would so because my ISO, I couldn't get to the 2000, I would have to adjust the other 2 settings to allow more light into the camera, right? So I could adjust the shutter speed and the aperture to compensate for that little bit less light that came in when I bumped my ISO from 2000 down to 1600. So again, this is not going to make complete sense right now until we start using the camera. Once you start using the camera, all of this stuff starts making a little bit more sense. So potentially later on, you may want to come back to this and you're like, now I get it. Now that I've used my camera a little bit, I understand the exposure triangle. So it's always one of those things, how much do you want to explain to somebody before you show them this diagram? It's important for you to see it before we kind of move into the next little exercise. Okay. Next class, oh, I don't have them handy, but I have a whole way, and one way that I've been thinking about for years of how to explain exposure that I'm going to do at the beginning of next class, because I'm still trying to make sure that it works. So I want to make sure the analogy holds water before I show you. So last class, and at the beginning of today's class, we talked about taking a photograph in auto and then finding the important information such as shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and recreating those settings in manual and taking the photograph again, right? I know I repeat myself all the time, but I could make this a 10-minute video, but usually this is how I teach the course, right? So, because I want to make sure that people, when they're watching this, are fully understanding what's going on. Okay, so let's now go to, so that's all fine, taking a photograph in auto mode, and then finding these numbers, writing them down, and then taking the photograph in manual. But that's kind of a bit of a time-consuming, there's like an extra little step there. And that would be difficult. Let's say you're at some event and you don't have time to take a photograph, write things down, while you've got, the president of the company standing there with their photo, and you can't take a photograph of them. Okay, let me just write these settings down. Okay, good. I'm switch it to manual, and I'm gonna change, like, they're off and moving. So you don't have time to do that. What I showed you was a trick to help you understand this whole process. What we want to do now is we want to know how to take photographs in manual to start with, right? So that we leave auto behind completely, right? We want to, we're getting on this train, the manual train, and we are going off into the sunset, and we're leaving our summer love auto mode behind, right? We're breaking up with auto. Okay, so this is, I think, where it starts getting exciting, and this is going to be a bit of a challenge for me, because usually when I'm teaching this, I'm in a room with a whole bunch of people with different cameras, and I can come around and make sure everybody's got this correct. So it's going to be, I'm trying to think in my head how best to do this. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is, in order to find out what those settings should be when you're right in manual. So I've now put my camera in manual, right? I'm in manual, lens cap is off, camera is on. And I probably see something like this on the back of the camera, right? A bunch of my numbers here, but like, what do let's say I want to take a picture of, what could I take a picture of here? Let's do something a little bit different. I've got, let's not take a picture of a tape measure. Let's take a picture just of another camera, right? And so I want to take this photograph, and where would I even start, right? Like, what settings should I be in? ISO 100, like you said, the lowest ISO possible. Should I be there, right? Should I be at f4.5 or 5.6 or 3 or, and what should my shutter speed? I don't have no idea where to even begin. Well, so let's just say right now we have this is a 6 second long, 6 second long exposure, f4.5 aperture, ISO 100. So how do we know? I could just right now take this photograph and let's see. Right now the camera's saying it's probably a little bit too close. So this camera's still taking a photograph, 6 second long exposure. What is the result? Okay, look at this photograph. Let's So, well, it's kind of hard to see, but this image is a total blurred out, overexposed, and overexposed we'll talk about in a second, but everything's really bright. I wouldn't know what this is. If I just showed you this picture on the screen, you would have no idea what we're looking at. So it's too bright and it's all blurry. So if I go back to my settings, right, one way for me to tell, even before I took that photograph, is I can press the button that takes the pictures, the shutter release button. If I tap that down, what it does is it's taking an exposure reading. And let me see if I bring my camera up a little bit closer to the... So you see up here now, when I tap the shutter release, I'm tapping that little button. It sends a little beam of light, depending on the make and model camera, probably coming out of the autofocused assist illuminator, measuring the exposure, how much light there is, and it bounces off this camera and back into the camera sensor, and the camera makes a judgment. And it's saying, so here's my exposure meter. This little thing that says -3, -2, -1, 0, +1, +2, +3. All right, so you see those settings. Now, when I press the shutter release down, do you see how right under the number 2, all of a sudden a little dot lit up? And now it's kind of shifting, and then it disappeared. Right, what happened? Well, it did a reading, and then the battery, to save energy, has shut the reading off, and now it's just kind of waiting. I tap it again. Oh, it did another reading. Right, now we're at... Now, let's say if I just do this again, I'm going to hold my hand over the camera, over the lens here, just to darken it, and do another reading. Now we're at like -1.5, right? And take my hand off, and then it goes +2 again. So you see it's jumping around. Do you see that happening with your camera? You want to find that exposure meter. It's going to be different on different cameras, and it's also, you're going to see this inside your viewfinder too. So it's going to move up and down depending on how bright or dark it is. You may even see something, let's say I'm just going to crank this even higher. So if I do this, and I'm pressing the button, and I'm like, I don't see anything happening. What's going on? Like, why? My camera must be broken or something, I guess, right? I don't see anything. And I tap my finger on the shutter release again, and I don't know if you can see this, but a little triangle appeared right next to +3. And what that is saying is, you're not even on the meter. You are so far off, it's not even funny, right? That's what the camera's saying to you. It's saying, hey buddy, if we take this picture right now, there's gonna be way too much light. We're at like +50 right now, let alone +3 or +2. Like, your 25-second long exposure, that is just like so much light is gonna come into the picture, it's gonna be all white, right? So, notice how I'm going to do that again, and then I'm going to crank. Now do you see how it's starting to... Now it's right at 0. That exposure meter is right around 0, and it's obviously changes when I move my camera around a little bit. Now, if I try to take this photograph, so now it's at like 1/8 of a second here, and you can't really see because of the quality. The photograph looks good in terms of the exposure. I like the amount of light in here, but it's a little bit blurry. And why is it a little bit blurry? Well, our shutter speed it's faster, but it's still around 1 second long. So I can't hold my camera still for 1 second without a little bit of camera shake being introduced into the picture. All right, so I'll do this again, and I'm just gonna, with the same settings, take a picture, and then this is just like a mess of an image because I moved my camera and now it's all blurry. Now you could use this for artistic effects. Artists do this kind of stuff all the time, but So if I look at the picture, my exposure meter is saying it's a good photograph, but it's way too slow. So one of the things we want to do if we're hand holding the camera is you generally want to be over 1/50th of a second or faster, because the slower you get, the more danger there is for camera shake. So I'm going to make my shutter speed at least 1/50. And then I do another exposure reading, and then again, I'm like, where's my meter? It disappeared. It's not even on the scale. But I see that little triangle here, and that's saying, hey buddy, look at you. It's now way too dark. You're off the scale. It's pointing off the scale. You're not even on the scale. It's way too dark now. So how can I brighten the picture up? If I keep speeding my shutter speed up, it's just going to get darker and darker and darker and darker. So I don't want that. I'm going to stay at 1/50th of a second. Now, I have two other options here to adjust. I have Aperture and ISO. Now, the lower the ISO number, right, so I've just tapped the plus and minus to adjust my aperture, right, and I can go up and down. The lower the number, the more light that comes in, because it's opening up this big opening. Now the depth of field shrinks. I know this is going to get a little bit confusing, so I'm trying not to, but so if I try to do this, I go to the lower number and I try to do another reading, it's off the charts, right? Conversely, oops, if I go all the way up, I'm actually letting far less light in, and I do another reading and I'm still way off the chart. So that's not going to work. I'm going to go back to 4.0. So the only other setting I have now in order to take this picture is my ISO. Now, I said before I want my ISO to be at the lowest setting humanly possible, but that doesn't mean I can always stay at ISO 100 or 80 or sometimes you have maybe even lower, right? So I'm going to go up. Let's go to 200. I do another reading. Oh, and look at this. The camera, and I do another exposure reading, and the camera's saying, oh, we're now at -3. So we're back on the chart here, right? Okay, but it's still going to be too dark, right? If I take this photograph, right, it's really dark image, so not nearly bright enough. Let's go to 400 and take another reading. Oh, it's saying, look at that, 1.8 or something, right? -1.8. Try to take it. It's still too dark. Let's go to 800. We're still -1. Picture. It's still too dark. Let's go to 1600. And look at this. I'm right in the middle. I'm at 0 on my meter. I take a picture. And then I look at the picture. And then I go, yeah, okay. That's pretty good. But you know what? It kind of still to me looks a little bit dark. It still looks like down here in the shadows of this picture, it's just not as bright as I would hope it to be. And then, so we're going to adjust the ISO one more time. Let's go to 3200. Now I press here and it's still around 0. Oh, it's kind of 0 plus 1 area here. Let's take another photograph. Okay. And then I look at this picture and I go, you know what? I think that's the picture. I think I'm pretty happy with this. Again, you can't see it on your screen as well, but what is important to know about this is that I actually went a little bit higher, a little bit brighter, and then what my exposure meter was saying the photograph should be at to take the picture that I wanted. According to the camera, the one where it was right in the center was the better photograph. But it doesn't matter what your camera thinks, it's what you think, what you see, right? So what we've just kind of learning here is why knowing how to use the manual settings of your camera is so important, because now I can set it to take the photograph I want. I'm not relying on the auto mode of my camera to determine what my pictures are looking like. Because again, I hear this all the time from people who take my classes, is that, yeah, I've spent $2,000 on this camera, but I'm thinking about getting a different one because I don't think it works. Photographs tend to be kind of dark or bright, and it works 50% of the time, but it's just, yeah, I don't know, it's a piece of junk. I think I dropped it or whatever, right? And I'm listening, yeah, well, interesting. Well, you know what? I hate to break it to you. I don't say, I'm trying to, but I say, well, it's probably, it looks like you actually have a really, really nice camera. $2,000 camera is a great camera. So it's probably you just don't know how to use your camera is the problem, right? So because your camera is in auto mode, it's doing its best, like the taxi cab driver, to get you to the destination as quickly as possible, but it's a different experience than you getting in your car, right? And you're like, oh, I know I can cut down this alleyway and I can go here, and I know when the light changes, and there's construction here, I'm going to avoid all this, and I'm going to get to the airport 20 minutes faster than the taxi cab driver, right? So in that same instance, being able to control your camera to take the picture you want to take is why, once you know how to do these things, you're less likely to ever go back to auto. Okay, so we're at the 5 o'clock time here. We've been going for almost an hour. So there's obviously plenty of stuff that we could talk about more going forward, but let me just, do I want to even, well, okay, I'm just going to, on the screen here. So just kind of to close out, when our camera, when the exposure meter, and you can see so there's these 3 photographs of James Dean. Hopefully people know who James Dean is. Even he died 40 years before I was born, right? But great actor. Anyway, so the photograph in the middle is a so-called, let's say, well-exposed photograph of James Dean. In that photograph, we can see his hair. It's a little bit pixelated because of the size of this PDF, but his hair is a little bit, we can see the strands of hair, and we can see the texture on his face, we can see his eyes. For all intents and purposes, it's a good photograph. And you can see in the center, or right below that, there's a little exposure meter, and the little triangle is pointing down at the 0. And that's saying that photograph, is a well-exposed photograph. It's not too bright, not too dark. If we go to the right next to it, we see a photograph of the same photograph of James Dean, but it is overexposed. It's too bright, right? So we've now lost the detail in the nose. We've lost details forehead. Everything just sort of looks a little washed out. So it's now +1, right? Or +2 or +5. It's overexposed, too bright. And the danger with an overexposed image is when things get white like that, then there's actually no information in the camera. So it's very hard to fix a photograph like that later on in Photoshop, for instance. So you're kind of stuck with that. That image is going to be kind of like that from here on in. On the other end of the scale, we have an underexposed image, a picture that did not have enough light, right? So in this instance, it's really dark, right? Now we can't really see his eyes. We've lost kind of the highlights in his hair. The background is just kind of blown out, and it's dark, and it's just like he's kind of fading into the background. So, and then the exposure meter's telling us it's at -1 or -5 or somewhere around there, right? It's saying it's too dark. So we want to be generally closer to 0 whenever we're taking photographs. Now, again, just like in the demonstration I did here when I was taking photographs of my camera, is there are times where you take your photograph, like you set your exposure to 0, and you take the photograph, and it turns out like this. It turns out overexposed. Or it turns out like this, it's underexposed. And you're like, what? The stupid thing said I should be at 0. I put my camera to 0, I took the picture, and it's too bright or too dark. What is going on? Well, again, that's why learning the manual settings of your camera is so important, because you're in the range, but now you can set your camera to, you can adjust one of the 3 settings, ISO, shutter speed, or aperture, to let more or less light in to get the picture to look more like what you want it to look like. So, I think that so what I want you to do for next week is I want you to practice taking photographs just using the exposure meter, right? So that involves just turning your camera on. So let's do this again. I'm going to, where can I take a picture of should have a whole bunch of little things. Okay, I've got this little thing for my daughter. This, sometimes she comes down here and plays with me while I'm in the studio. So I've got this little creature here, and I want to take a photograph of it, right? I'm going to turn my camera on. I'm in manual mode, and I'm going to move that just a little bit off, and then see if I can just, so you can see me doing some of this on camera. So I'm pointing the camera at it, right? And I can see my exposure reading. The settings are pretty similar to where they were last time. So in fact, you know what I'm just going to do, just to kind of, I'm just going to whack all my settings all the way out, just so we can, you know, to give you more, you know, because sometimes this is, you get your camera and all the settings are all wacky and you're like, what? Where do I go? Okay, so my camera is saying it's a little bit bright. And I take that picture and I look at it and I go, well, you know what? Actually, not a bad photograph. Even though I just randomly set the 3 settings to these random numbers, right? Not a bad photograph. And so that was 1/4 of a second, f/22, ISO 12,800. So I can take a photograph like this, but it may not be the best photograph for the job, because a few things happening here. I'm at 1/4 of a second, which means the potential for camera shake is very high. That I'm actually surprised that that image wasn't all blurry, because it's so slow of a shutter speed. So I actually want to, oops, let's go back up to 1/50th of a second. So that's going to make for a little bit of a sharper image. Now when I tap my photo, the shutter release button, the button that takes photographs, and do an exposure reading, I'm now -2 because I've sped the shutter speed up, letting less light in, like the tap, right? And I've gone from turning the tap on for a little bit, turning it off, to going this, right? So there's not as much light coming into the camera. How do I let more light into the camera? Well, I'm at ISO 12,800. This is the most sensitive my camera can possibly be right now. So I can't raise it any higher, right, to brighten it up. So the only other way I can adjust things is using the aperture. My f22, well, let's reduce that. Let's go down to, let's say, f14. Do another reading. Well, you know, I'm still at -1, so let's keep on going. I'm at f10. Now I'm pretty close to 0, so let's just take this picture. Okay, so of course you're not going to really be able to see these results, but actually pretty darn good picture. I'm pretty happy with that. Now, just to kind of bring things back to the beginning, we talked about ISO and wanting to keep a low ISO number. Now, I'm just going to do that again. I pressed play, and then I'm zooming into the picture using the magnifying glass with the little, I'm just going to come up here. So on the Canon here, I'm pressing this button, and it's zooming into the photograph. So you see I'm getting close, even though you can't really see what, it doesn't look that great on the screen. And I can move around in the picture up and down. Right, that little icon here is telling me where I am in the full picture. Now, you might have the ability to pinch and zoom just like on your iPhone, right? So the thing is, though, when I look at this picture up close, is that it's all grainy and pixelated. It's not sharp at all, right? So yes, when I'm all zoomed out, it's okay, but if I tried to print this picture, I'm probably not going to be happy with it. I'm going to probably complain to the photo place and say, you developed my picture, but something's wrong with your chemicals or whatever. You guys are, you know, ripped me off. My picture looks all pixelated. What's going on here, right? And the person behind the counter is going to have to delicately explain that, actually, I took a really crummy photograph with a super high ISO, so actually it's my fault, right? So, okay, so instead of being at ISO 12,800, let's reduce the ISO. So let's go down to something more manageable, like in this room, you know, it's a little bit darker. I've got a bunch of lights in here, but it's still kind of dark. So I put it at ISO 800. Now, if I go to take a picture again, whoa, now I'm off the charts again. Now I'm -3. So, what's going on here? I thought I was going to take a better picture, but now it's too dark. So what do I do now? Well, I want to keep my shutter speed at 1/50, and I want to keep my ISO at 800 if possible, right? So what is the other setting I can adjust? Well, it's the aperture. So I'm at f10. Let's go down to my lowest one possible, 3.5. Okay. And when I do exposure reading, I'm now at -1. But let's take a photograph. I might have to... Okay. So if I look at this photograph, it looks pretty good on your viewer on the screen, your computer screen. For me, it looks a little bit dark. So let's just see, you know, here's these kind of 3 photographs, right? This one is clearly the darkest one of all. So what do I do now? Well, I'm at the lowest aperture. My shutter speed is at 1/50 of a second, so I don't want to go any slower than that because I don't want any camera shake. So I am going to have to go up a little bit with my ISO. And now I look at my exposure meter, and it's kind of hard. I can't really show it to you because if I do, it'll the setting will change. I take a photograph, and boom, this is a gorgeous photograph, right? So that is the result of me playing with those settings. So I would be able to go much, I wouldn't be fumbling back and forth so much, because I've had decades of experience using a camera, and so it takes a little bit of time to get this. It probably not as much time as you think. If you spend some time this week playing with your camera, trying these different kinds of, trying to take photographs in manual using your exposure meter, it gets easier and easier and easier and easier to understand and to make adjustments, right? If you only use your camera for 10 minutes once a week, all of this is just going to quickly go in one ear, out the other ear, over your head, etc., right? You really have to pick your camera up and play with it as much as possible. And I totally understand the at first, using your camera and trying to make it work is frustrating, and it's not rewarding, and you just feel like, am I ever going to get this? But you're learning slowly by slowly until all of a sudden things start clicking into gear, and then boom, you never look back. And it's just, it's like riding a bicycle. Once you've learned it, it's very hard. You're not going to, be the best bicycle rider ever if you haven't ridden a bicycle in 20 years, but you know what I mean. The analogy holds up, which is why I'm using it. Okay. So, what I want you to do for before our next class on Monday is to, you could do this sitting on your couch, sitting on your balcony, in your backyard. You can take photographs from inside your car. You could take photographs of your partner making dinner, or while you're making dinner, take a couple snaps, while you've put some baking in the oven and it's going to take 20 minutes to cook. Instead of flopping down on the couch and just sort of mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, pick up the camera, document, the mess left in the kitchen, right? And then all of a sudden, you're like, oh, don't clean the plates because I've got all this cool stuff. I like all the baking powder and the flour and broken eggshells and stuff. I'm going to document this, right? And so you get your camera, put it right into manual, and then start taking some photographs, right? The other thing that it's not going to, you're not going to have, if you take 100 photographs, you're not going to have 100 great photographs. And that's one thing that I should mention, is that, I think people have this assumption that the better you are as a photographer, the more you know your camera, that every photograph you take from here on in is going to be absolute gold. That you're gonna master your camera, and then you're gonna walk out the door, and you're just going to take every photograph you're going to take is going to be for the cover of National Geographic, right? It's going to, but that's just not. That's no professional photographer works that way. If you've ever seen, there's documentaries out there of, there was one recently, a number of videos about the photographers who were taking photos during the Tiananmen Square, and so they showed like all of the photo, like that famous photograph, the person standing in front of a tank. Anyway, there's like 50 photographs of that moment until the one iconic photograph was captured, right? So there was even a great photographer is shooting lots of photographs trying to get to the right photograph. You saw a couple episodes ago showing you photographs I took of my daughter, and I've got plenty more that I want to show you next class. But my daughter's moving around and stuff, and I'm kind of trying to it's me and my daughter here. I'm managing her, right? I have to try to take a bunch of photographs, and then I'm going to look at them later on in the computer and find the best one, right? As much as there are some, I know there's probably some, great photographer who's like, no, when I go to an event, I take 5 photographs, right? And they're all perfect. Well, I just don't even believe that they operate that way. I believe, you know, they are taking more than 5 photographs, and most of those photographs are not usable images. And if anything, maybe that person takes 5 photographs, but then they go home and spend an hour on the computer editing those photographs. It's just, that's how photographers work. And so don't allow yourself to the self-talk to get in your head of saying, if I don't take beautiful photographs, every single photograph, then I'm a worthless photographer and I should try a different hobby. Give yourself the leeway to take lots of photographs, make a whole bunch of miserable, bad photographs. If you go out for an hour or 20 minutes and you take 30, 40 photographs and you end up with one photograph, just one photograph, that is not even amazing, but it's good, boom, that's good. That's actually really good. Imagine, you know, you're trying to put together a portfolio of your photos for a website, and you go out and you take, and you every day you go out and take, you know, 200 photographs, and each day you get just one good photograph that can go up on your website. Well, that's actually great. That's fantastic, right? Because you'll have probably different photos of different things each day. Okay, so we've sort of been over the lesson for about 10 minutes now while I've been talking. Just before we wind down, I want to, if there's any photographs anybody sent me, I'm happy to look through them and give you some feedback. I don't think there has been any yet. Let me just check here on the computer to see. Oh, maybe there is something coming in here. I don't think so. Just refreshing this. Okay, I don't think I see anything anybody sent me. Okay, so in that case, if there's no photos that people have sent me to review or to give you feedback on, which is, personally, I would take advantage of it, then I think we'll wind down. I see a couple comments there. The Real Mithril says hello, and Benjamin Hecker says, is there a class on Victoria Day Monday? And yes, I mean, in terms of the way the world is right now, there's for me, every day is sort of a little bit like a holiday. I'm stuck in my house, so yeah, there's no difference between next week's Victoria Day and any other Monday while I'm in this quarantine situation. So yeah, we'll do a class, same time, same place, on Monday. Please take some photographs. Like, there's no way you are going to understand any of this stuff unless you are getting your feet wet. Right, you're putting on your muddy boots and you're jumping out into the water and into the whatever weird analogy. I'm losing my mind. So take some photographs. Send me some photographs, even if they're not the best photographs. I can help you work through any potential problems in your photos. If your photos are too blurry, if they're too dark, if they're too bright, or the focus seems to always be off, or all those different things, and you're just getting super frustrated with this camera and thinking, maybe I should just go back to using my smartphone or my pocket. Well, let me tell you, the phone in your pocket is nowhere near, not even near, like 1/10 of the quality of photographs that your digital camera can do, right? Even this camera is like 7 years old or something. It is 100 times better than my iPhone, my a year-old iPhone, right? So you could go to a thrift store and buy a $50 camera. It's going to be better than your iPhone. There are some things the iPhone or the Android phone can do better than these. That's a whole other conversation. But so it's just a matter of learning these principles and applying them to get better at photography. And when you start mastering this stuff, like I'm telling you, next on Monday, when we start talking about how to control aperture, people's minds explode. And they go, whoa, wait a second. I can take photographs like that on this cheap camera? Whoa, okay, maybe I don't need to spend a few $100s to upgrade to whatever new thing, shiny thing I saw in the store window. Because you can, like, without a doubt, do it on your camera. So, before we go, please like, subscribe, hit the little notification bell so you can get notified if you are getting some extra value out of these classes. I would love to have your donation as a little link to the PayPal in the description below. And send me your photographs for next week, you know, maybe a couple hours before we go live so I can load them up in here. Otherwise, have a safe rest of your week. I guess this weekend is a holiday. I didn't even know it was. So enjoy that, if it is a holiday, wherever you are on our beautiful planet. And, yeah. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, everybody. Thank you so very much. And let me see. I'm pinning this up on here. And goodbye.